There have been plenty of times where I see some content that I relate to. Maybe it's a bit crunchy, maybe it's about trying to avoid too much plastic in the home. I click on the women's page and I start seeing stuff about only eating red meat. I see stuff about drinking raw milk. I then see stuff about not vaccinating your kids. And I'm like, oh, it's that kind of crunchy. And that's not my vibe at all. Okay, I'm going to try and not get too heated when talking about this subject, but bear with me, okay? Today we are talking about the crunchy to conservative pipeline, and I have a lot of thoughts, I have a lot to say, but first I want to introduce myself. I'm Carla. I make cultural commentary videos like this, but I haven't made one in ages. I've been doing lots of vlogs about my life as an American living in London, crocheting, crafting, just getting up to like wholesome activities, you know, going for coffee, days in my life, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in any of that, please do subscribe. Usually I'm focusing on sustainability, fast fashion, but I feel like this crunchy to conservative pipeline is kind of in that realm because if you're interested in sustainable fashion, you might also be a little bit of a crunchy girl, okay? I did do a video about an adjacent topic, I think this past summer, and it was basically like, does crafting, crocheting, doing activities like this kind of make you a trad wife? Because that was the first time that I sort of noticed this overlap between people who care about making things homemade or care about avoiding synthetic fibers or see value in creating things from scratch, and people who are maybe against vaccines or have a certain vision of what the ideal American family looks like. And by the way, I'm obviously going to be crocheting while I talk about this. We're just gonna have a casual chat on this topic today. You know, we're not gonna do too much of a deep dive because there is so much to this, but without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, lefty hippie girlies, I feel like the trad wives are eating us up and it's time for us to step it up. We used to run the crunchy granola space, and then all of a sudden, if I'm like scrolling on TikTok and I see crunchy granola stuff, it's all of a sudden like a pathway, crunchy granola to alt-right, crunchy granola to raw milk. And like, okay, my type of feminism, I want women to show up however they want to show up, but I feel like learning how to mend things, make things, etc., not for men necessarily, but for us, are just really important skills to have and can also help us live more sustainable lives. So like, where are the lefty crunchy granola girlies? Who are they? I'm one of them. Hello.
So actually, if you search crunchy to conservative pipeline, this is not something that has just popped up in, you know, the last 10 years on social media with veganism and turning into all meat diets and avoiding food dyes and additives and eventually vaccines. Like, it is not a new thing. There's actually this article from NPR published in 2006, and it goes back way further than that, but this is from 2006, from Rod Dreher. I did a bit of digging into this man's background. Let's just first look into how he was defining crunchy conservatism in 2006. He said being a crunchy conservative is nothing new. It's simply a rediscovery of an old-fashioned sensibility the right used to champion back in the day. Crunchy cons, as he calls them, prefer old houses and mom-and-pop shops to McMansions and strip malls. Already there we see the sort of links with someone who is on the left, you know. A lot of leftists are not fans of McMansions, are not fans of giant corporations, and instead want to promote things like shopping small. But as we'll see later, the motives behind these, I guess, ideals or lifestyle changes are very different depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on. Dreher says that conservatives ought to be suspicious of big government and big business, that local traditions should be defended, and that the family, not the state or the corporation, is the institution most necessary to conserve. Stand up for those things nowadays on the right, this was in 2006, and you might get denounced as a utopian, a despiser of capitalism, even, study yourself, a liberal. So as promised, I wanted to give you a bit of background into who Rod Dreher is. This is from a 2024 interview with Dreher in a Slovakian conservative news site. Rod Dreher is an American writer and editor currently living in Budapest. His work deals with culture, politics, and religion. He calls on Christians to separate themselves to some degree from mainstream culture and to create a countercultural movement to preserve the fullness of the Christian faith. He is also a close friend of U.S. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, and it was Dreher's interview with him for the American Conservative that spread awareness of this politician, Vance, among conservatives. Dreyer also played a significant role in Vance's conversion to Catholicism. So even if we can agree with some of the things that he said he wanted to protect through crunchy conservatism in that 2006 NPR article, I think it's pretty clear by now that there's a lot that I don't agree with. To me, it's clear that the utopian vision that Rod Dreyer has of a crunchy conservative world is not one that is focused on community. He's instead more worried about things like gender ideology, pro-choice legislation, and the fact that America is a post-Christian society, as he says in that article. He actually says that as a Christian himself, he actually hates that the US is a post-Christian society, which I thought a true patriot would be in support of the separation of church and state, but that's just me. He even expresses that Trump isn't the ideal candidate for him, but only because Trump isn't conservative enough for Dreyer. He wrote about this in depth in an article for the European Conservative called "The Enemy of My Enemy is Donald J. Trump," basically explaining why he would be voting for Trump despite his flaws. He even talks about something about like the discrimination that American families of European descent face in the US, which is just how you know this man is like a real wacko, in my opinion. But I'm not just making this all up with like Rod Dreyer as this one case study. This is something that we see on social media and that was actually prevalent even in the 70s and 80s. This is from a 2022 article in The Atlantic. In the 1970s and 80s, women in the emergent white power movement, which gathered Christian identity members, tax resistors, and other militant right activists, deployed what we would now call crunchy issues as part of a wider articulation of cultural identity. These bits of crunchiness included organic farming, a macrobiotic diet, neo-paganism, anti-fluoridation, and traditional midwifery. All of these are often thought of as leftist or hippie issues, but they appeared regularly in the robust outpouring of women's publications in the white power movement. And I could probably do a whole video about women being used to make the ideas of the far right seem more palatable to other women, to themselves, and to society as a whole, but that would be a whole other topic, but a related topic nonetheless. Especially because a lot of these crunchy activities, if you want to partake in them in order to conserve some sort of vision of America, of a perfect family that is of European descent, where the mom stays at home and does the cooking, she's going to be the one taking part primarily in these crunchy activities, or at least pushing them forward in daily life. And this isn't to say that in the 70s and 80s, crunchy always meant right wing. That's not the case at all. Of course, we had the hippie movement. Hippies were typically seen as people who cared about the environment, often becoming vegetarians, vegans, who cared about living in close-knit communities, growing their own food. I highly recommend reading that article from The Atlantic. It is jam-packed with lots of interesting material, but obviously I couldn't just like quote the article for this whole video. But I highly recommend reading that, as well as this New York Times feature on how the right claimed crunchy. It's written by an Oberlin alumna, and if you know anything about Oberlin College, even to this day, it is very much known as, you know, your classic liberal arts college with lots of leftists, maybe lots of hippies, and back in the day, this was even more true. Lisa Miller writes, in the 1980s, crunchy held a faintly pejorative meaning. One didn't announce oneself as crunchy with pride. It felt more like a fashion or anti-fashion statement than a political stance. Though if pressed, I would have noted that crunchy often aligned with vegetarianism, which aligned with environmentalism, which was political. She continues, the crunchies I knew held high-minded liberal notions about food equity and clean oceans and air. They lived in group houses and expressed their idealism through hours of meetings in which they hashed out by consensus how to live. Today, in contrast, there's an individualism at the heart of the crunchy realm. And to me, this gets to the difference between the two sides of what it could mean to be crunchy. The motive behind living a sort of crunchy lifestyle. Is it to protect the earth and the communities who are most affected by climate change? Is it to promote better access for all people to clean water and healthy foods? Or is it just to go back to an idealized vision of America that excludes people of color, queer people, etc.? But despite the motives being different, there's actually, a lot of similarities between a crunchy right-wing person and a crunchy left-wing person, such as distrust in big business, distrust in politicians, a desire to improve one's health, a concern for the health of their children, and a recognition that Americans do have so many health issues. But on the side of the right, not being able to recognize that perhaps improving access to clean food, to clean water, could help alleviate some of these issues, as well as programs like affordable healthcare or even free healthcare, and instead completely denying science and only focusing on certain toxins and minor ingredients as the culprit to the country's health issues. It's a very, very individualistic way of thinking. Basically, what I'm trying to say, and what I think a lot of people try to say online, is that we do have a lot more in common than we think, and that can be a really powerful realization. That article from The Atlantic talks about how we see the far right to far left political spectrum as a flat line, which gives the impression that those two sides of the political spectrum have absolutely nothing in common, which isn't true. The left are communists and the right are fascists, and that's it. And to explain how we got there, I think this quote from the New York Times article really helps to sum things up. Crunchy started to evolve from the communitarian idea to a narrower, more self-centered focus. Crunchy parents began to see themselves as solo actors, struggling to raise children in a poisonous world. I think we all already know that the US is a very individualistic society. I feel like we're even taught that as kids growing up and going to public school in the United States, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you can get what you want as long as you work hard enough, and to some extent that it's okay to do whatever it takes to achieve what you want to achieve. So it's not really a surprise that people are going to approach their valid concerns for their family's health with a very self-centered mindset. The New York Times article interviewed a nutritionist and epidemiologist from UNC who said, "Parents know that our kids are unhealthier than they ever have been before, and no one is really taking action about it. But," she said, "the concern is misplaced on certain toxins." This is talking in context of, being very scared of food dyes and certain additives, as opposed to being concerned about our access to clean water and fresh ingredients. When really the article states it's more high fat, high sugar, high salt content in processed foods that are the culprits. The author of this article, Lisa Miller, used Emily Morrow, who is very popular on social media and runs a blog called Really Very Crunchy, as one of her case studies or examples of someone who is in this sort of crunchy to conservative pipeline, or has perhaps already arrived. And this sort of content is often very lighthearted, it's making fun of the fact that you're a bit crunchy, that you care about these things, and that you go to what some would call extremes to make sure that your children and the rest of your family are consuming only ingredients that you deem to be acceptable. And this sort of content can be relatable, and I might relate to a lot of it. I might find some of it aspirational, and it makes sense why this sort of content can be a really easy way for right-wing organizations to recruit women who know that they want to revert to a more natural way of living, but maybe haven't fully thought out a less individualistic perspective of the issues that they are concerned about. And honestly, I think something that gave me the advantage of being able to recognize this pipeline online and social media content is the fact that I'm not white. I don't see myself represented in a lot of this sort of crunchy content. I do follow quite a few women of color who are in this sort of crunchy environmentalist space, but it's always been clear to me that they care about marginalized communities, that they're coming at this from an environmentalist perspective, and not out of a conservative perspective. And aside from those creators, there have been plenty of times where I see some content that I relate to. Maybe it's a bit crunchy, maybe it's about, trying to avoid too much plastic in the home. I click on the women's page and I start seeing stuff about only eating red meat. I see stuff about drinking raw milk. I then see stuff about not vaccinating your kids. And I'm like, oh, it's that kind of crunchy. And that's not my vibe at all. Despite me being able to recognize this sort of pipeline content quite early on, I was still horrified to see that this exists on social media right now. And this is very similar to how other people feel. This is actually how the Atlantic article ends. Many people who advocate for crunchy issues expressed horror and surprise at the pipeline conversation because they felt manipulated. And yes, this is manipulation. It's direct recruitment. And let's not be confused about the endgame. White power activists, then and now, envision an all-white ethno-state, or world achieved through profound violence, and no macrobiotic diet or apple cider vinegar remedy can ameliorate that message. Oof. That is a intense way to end that article, but valid. And I assume if you're watching to the end of this video that you and I are probably on the same page, or if you even made it through like the first 5 minutes of this video. But I want to also address the fact that this isn't just something that's harmful to so-called woke liberals or snowflakes or whatever sort of label you want to give to people who are on the left. It's not just community that's at risk. It's not just access to quality food and clean water that's at risk. It's not just a focus on ethical consumption, but public health, which affects all of us, is also at risk. Ashlyn Bristol was a case study in the New York Times article who says that she no longer likes the crunchy label because of its sort of right-wing connotations at the moment. She runs a homesteading farm or whatever in Vermont, and the types of families that, are her customers, she has to explain to them why she vaccinates her animals. And she's even going to start introducing a pasteurized milk line at her farm, which I think is a good choice. From the article, similarly, she and her partner are planning to produce a line of pasteurized milk in a future Trump-Kennedy world where farms like hers are allowed to grow bigger and more deregulated. The risk of foodborne illnesses increases. We're worried that people aren't taking this risk seriously enough, says Ashlyn. And if they get sick, that's our business, that's our livelihood. Ashlyn Bristol started farming 15 years ago and has started to feel more alien in the world she inhabits. And she has loosened her formerly tight grip on what she and her family eat. She still mostly eats off her own farm, but some of my food can come from the grocery store and it doesn't rock my identity. I can eat bananas and not feel like I'm contributing to the end of the world. Her life may look like a crunchy idea, but in truth, Bristol told me with a rueful laugh, my identity is the furthest from that than it has ever been. That was how the New York Times article ended, by the way. Also very strong ending. That sort of got into past points that I was bringing up, but what I really wanted to highlight from that was her concern for her business and her concern for public health. If we start having less regulated farms, there is a big risk that foodborne illnesses, like this article says, will increase, which is something that we've already seen cases of in the news in the US, which is horrible for everyone because being ill is not nice, and I thought that was something that we were really trying to avoid in the first place. And two, it's also really, really horrible for business, and I imagine that a lot of these people who are on the right do care about family-owned businesses and do want farms in their local areas to thrive, at least in theory. So I think that's all I have to say today on this topic, but I just thought this was really interesting of this sort of like, okay, I see crunchy individuals as someone who, cares about the environment and who cares about their health and who also cares about science. And it was hard for me at first to wrap my head around the fact that someone who is very crunchy can not care about science, cannot necessarily be concerned about the environment, and can be coming at this from a completely different lens with slightly different concerns, and sometimes concerns that are a lot more ominous, like trying to protect the American family of European descent above all else. I don't like seeing these crunchy activities being co-opted for these motives, but that's what's happening right now. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this. I'm finishing my sleeve, so that's exciting. If we want to end on a somewhat positive note. But I guess what I'll leave you with is the fact that we are, you know, I hope, all more similar than we are different. And it's just the information that we have at our fingertips that changes the way we look at the issues around us. But I think if we just have conversations like this and approach them with an open mind and with the desire to learn, that we'll be in a better place. Maybe. I don't know. I don't have the answers. I hope you enjoyed this video. Next video will probably be a vlog or something crochet related. All right. Thank you so much for being here, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.